Well, let's get started in my first primer here at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. Is the Green New Deal green tyranny?
In a word, yeah. The Green New Deal is well, if we go back, the first time I sat in this theatre, I think was for a TPPF crossroads. And what people here were trying to do, and a very engaged audience were trying to do, was trying to alert the conservative movement to the importance of energy. And it was always kind of an uphill struggle, like the importance of energy. Conservatives just take energy for granted. And look, along comes AOC and the Green New Deal, and suddenly energy is a top issue. It will be one of the top 3 issues in the 2020 campaign. So I think we've got a lot to be grateful for. But it does. The reason the Green New Deal spells tyranny is because decarbonisation is the greatest, most potent tool of social control the progressives have yet got into their hands, because only a hugely intrusive and powerful administrative state can decarbonise basically a hydrocarbon economy, an energy-intensive economy like the United States, and profoundly change it in the attempt. It means ever tighter and more intrusive control of energy production, of energy consumption, of transportation, of urban planning, of diet and lifestyle. I mean, remember that livestock burn methane, so we shouldn't eat meat. Everything electrical and combustible, everything that moves, everything that breathes. So climate change has given progressives this enormous power, and it's ultimately, that's why the Green New Deal, it is fundamentally about transforming America. And I think one of the questions that I think, if you're looking back at American history, is why are progressives so fixated on FDR's New Deal? And it's not because it was a great economic success. In fact, it was terrible policies. In the economy in 1937, at the peak of the recovery after the crash, was actually smaller than it was in 1929. It's because the New Deal was about transforming America and creating a new democratic coalition. Now, I think what Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez is doing is actually doing the opposite. I think she's going to destroy the democratic coalition. We can come on to that.
So you say that with the New Deal, the economy in 1937 was smaller than it was in 1929. Is that?
That is correct. Milton Friedman once pointed out that period of economic history is unique in the annals of American history, and it's the only time the one deep recession followed on from the previous one. There was the recovery was. I mean, remember how we all used to complain about the anemic Obama recovery, right? Mm-hmm. And the fact that there was only a recovery essentially because of hydraulic fracturing and the shale revolution. I mean, let's not forget that. But there was a recovery in the 1930s. The recovery was just terrible. Before it, then you had another recession.
You mentioned Obama there in that last statement, the administration. You also mentioned, and I wrote it down, fundamentally transform. You believe the Green New Deal would fundamentally transform the United States, which is interestingly enough, because it wasn't that the term that Obama used when he was sworn in, or he wants to fundamentally transform our country. And the only reason I bring that up is because I heard a former Senator Phil Gramm say at a speech recently that if you love something, if you truly love something, you don't want to fundamentally transform it. And here we have people like AOC wanting to fundamentally transform our country. And you say it'll be detrimental.
Yeah, I think it's worse than that, because you heard AOC yesterday, and Fox have been replaying the clip endlessly about how capitalism is irredeemable. She wants to end capitalism. So this is transforming or deforming America, and it's abolishing capitalism. Well, that is a very big ask. I think why it will fail is because if you compare to what happened in why FDR won
elections was because he was giving away a lot of free stuff like Social Security. And if you were unionized labor, you were better off with collective bargaining because there was the big push to get wages up. With the Green New Deal, it means fewer manufacturing jobs. It means higher energy bills. To give you an idea, energy costs in Europe are about double those in the United States. The energy for industrial businesses in Europe is about 50% higher than the rest of the G20. So basically, you cannot compete with on manufacturing. You are going to see those manufacturing jobs that have come back to America be re-exported. So I think this is essentially, the Green New Deal is essentially declaring war on working people, and that's why it's going to be a very interesting for Democrats.
It's interesting to me that a friend told me he calls her Alexandria occasionally crazy, which I thought was kind of fun, and I told him I was going to use it, and I just did. But I don't know, occasionally maybe an understatement in my opinion. But it's interesting to note that she calls the New Deal, actually she did this past weekend while she was here in Austin attending our South by Southwest, which is really just, I think, a Democrat convention for a week is what it's become. She called the New Deal racist. And why would you have your model legislation named after something that's inherently racist? But it leads me to believe that it will ultimately impact the least among us, which disproportionately are minorities. Can you comment on how it's going to drive up energy costs, or what you've seen in European countries, Germany and others?
Well, you've got about 1 in 6 German households is threatened by fuel poverty, which is defined as spending 10% or more of their household income on energy bills. You've had a surge in German households being disconnected from the grid because they can't afford their electricity bills. But there's something else that goes on, and this is why I think it's very interesting politically. The rise of the Greens had a very bad effect on the SPD. To give you an example, in 1998, the federal election that brought the Red-Green coalition in Berlin to power, which is the first time the Greens took office in a coalition, the SPD, which is a bit like, they're sort of Democrats, I mean, they're sort of left of center, they won 40.9% of the vote. In the most recent federal election in 2017, their result was 20.5%. So the Greens, the presence of the Greens basically split the left of center movement, the left of center coalition, and has basically put the SPD in an existential crisis. It's never had such a terrible result as it had in 2017.
So 1 in 6 people are living in essentially energy poverty in Germany, and this is one of the largest economies in Europe. And I think I just saw something recently where they're going to, by, gosh, I can't remember the year, 2030, we're going to shut all of their remaining coal-generated plants that generate electricity. Is that correct?
Yeah, the Germans are in a desperate situation because, and this is a really interesting thing about the Greens, because the moral blackmail is, unless you decarbonize, you're gonna destroy the planet. I mean, it is complete moral blackmail. But actually, look what the Greens are most against, and that's nuclear power. If you're serious about decarbonizing, you say we're going to build lots of nuclear power stations. And what have the German Greens? Their key energy demand is phasing out nuclear power, which the Germans are doing. So they're shutting down their nuclear power stations. So what keeps the lights on when there's not enough wind and sun? Well, they've been building coal-fired power stations. They recently had a commission to say, when should we exit coal? And they're trying to fudge it, and they're trying to say, well, actually, it's going to be in 2030 or 2040, but we might not get there, kind of thing. To your point about energy poverty, in the UK, there was a measure of energy poverty which was basically driven by energy prices. And the government recognizes its policies, its green policies, were pushing up any energy bills. So their response was to change the definition of energy poverty. I mean, you cannot be more dishonest than that. And they changed it so that it was defined as proportion of households that could be living in buildings that could benefit from energy efficiency, which had nothing to do. So, and still they couldn't get the numbers down. I mean, they halved the numbers, but then they've gone up again. So when governments get into this position, they become dishonest, and also it also shows they don't put the welfare of ordinary people first, of particularly working people, the elderly who are most exposed. And the number of winter deaths you get in the United Kingdom of pensioners who can't afford their electricity bills. They turn down the heating because they're worried about how much money they're going to have left at the end of the month.
It's interesting. I spoke to someone his parents were from Germany, and he remembered as a child, and this is someone that's middle class, and he remembered the pipes that went through his home, and they heated their home with wood. And I was telling him, and that Kathleen White had educated me and told me that of the renewables that are burning in Europe, or that they're using, over 50% of the what's called renewable is timber. It's wood. They're burning wood, high particulate matter. But let's talk a little bit about, because you had an op-ed that was printed in the Wall Street Journal yesterday that talks about wind generation and talks a little bit about leakage. Tell us a little bit about what that means and how it's impacting Germany's neighbor, Poland, and the Czech Republic.
Yeah, I mean, one of the big problem, there are lots of big problems with renewables. Mike Schellenberger of the eco-modernists has pointed out the fundamental physical problem is that low energy density means you need massive amounts of infrastructure that's spread over hillsides and actually ends up destroying the environment, which is where environmentalism has led to this crazy situation of actually destroying the environment. But the other problem, of course, is that wind and solar don't respond to demand; they respond to the weather. And everyone can sort of intuitively see when there's not enough wind and sun, you don't have enough juice in the system, so you have to ramp up the gas and coal-fired power stations. That's what you have to do. But the flip side is at periods of load, sort of weekends, for example, in Germany, if it's sunny and there's a bit of wind, they produce far too much electricity, and they end up dumping it on their neighbors. And that has two effects. First of all, it overloads their neighbors' grids, so it's very difficult to manage these huge surges of power. But the other thing it does is it destroys the economics of their wholesale market. It destroys the economics of their power stations. And the op-ed I wrote in the journal yesterday saying, well, you've got a similar situation in California with all its solar energy, and it dumps it on Arizona. So you basically have a situation where one state's renewable mandates have a deleterious effect on their neighbors. And what the article calls for is the federal government to do what the Commerce Clause actually asks it to do, gives it sole responsibility, which is maintaining orderly relations between the sovereign states of the United States, because the whole point about having a federal system is you can't have states doing things to disadvantage through their policies the economic interests of other states.
You mentioned California, and I thought we were going to continue to talk about leakage, and because there's a lawsuit from the 200, which is this human rights organization that's suing the California Air Resources Board for policies that they believe are discriminatory to lower income Californians. And one of the things that they address is leakage, and it's California residents driven out of their state because of unaffordable housing prices. So I guess that's what we call Californians that have moved to Texas leakage because of policies that they've implemented in California. No offense to any Californians that are in the room. Welcome to Texas. Vote accordingly. But it's just interesting to me that some of these, so now we're seeing this lawsuit in California because of discriminatory political practices. And here at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, fighting renewable subsidies. And I did an interview this morning with a business journal in New York talking about our renewable subsidies and how they're affecting the market, because when you have a product that you can give away for free or pay your customers to take, why would your competition invest in new technology? And so that's kind of the issues that we're seeing here in Texas, is not a whole lot of new clean coal generation or not a lot of new natural gas generation.
That's absolutely right. What renewables do, because of their cost structure and their inability to regulate their output to demand, is it destroys the economics of thermal dispatchable generation. And it's a huge, huge problem. So you end up saying, well, then we have to pay our power station owners just to keep their power stations available. So basically, you double up on the capital requirement to power the grid, plus, of course, the extra grid infrastructure, which is also very big. So you have to hang out lots of transmission lines from remote areas, remote windy areas, and then you have to have grid reinforcement everywhere. So you're talking about actually more than doubling the capital required. I actually have a chapter in the book on California. It's called From Golden to Green, and the point I make there is that in many ways, California has European characteristics. I mean, it sits on the west coast of the United States, but in terms of its policies, I mean, what you see is it's very, very European, and the social stratification that you're getting is also Joel Kotkin's written a lot about this. Essentially, a feudal caste system sort of re-emerging with wealthy people living on the coast and inland. You could actually compare it to South Africa, apartheid South Africa. It's a terrible situation that they've got themselves into, and it's very difficult once you're there. It's very difficult to pull it round.
I noticed this morning the president tweeted a quote from Patrick Moore, who's one of the co-founders of Greenpeace, and it was talking about warning against climate alarmism, and was talking about carbon being the building block of life. And the president just put it in quotes and then just said, wow. And that was the only thing the president added was wow, based on this quote from this morning. But you've talking about decarbonization, and Kathleen talks about in her book, Fueling Freedom, how we're producing more food, 4 times the amount of food that we were 100 years ago on the same acreage that we're farming. And so we're feeding more people in our climate that we have now today. But talk a little bit more about decarbonization and some of the threats that has.
Yeah, I think decarbonization, I mean, that climate is a pretext for this. It's a pretext for control. As I mentioned earlier, if it really was about decarbonization, the Greens would be advocating nuclear power. And Patrick Moore makes the same point. And they're not doing that. And why do they like renewables? Well, renewables have, and there's a big chunk in the book about this as well, and it's to do with a really warped philosophy of anti-industrialization, anti-humanism. And where do you find it? And I think perhaps the most revealing, in some ways, revelation in the book is, which is the first political party anywhere in the world to have a wind power program, and it was the Nazi Party in the 1933 Reichstag elections. The Nazis had a wind power program. 6 weeks after invading the Soviet Union, Adolf Hitler was telling his dinner companions, wind power will be the future. And it's what's I think incredibly chilling about what you see in that period is virtually every single demand you get from the Greens is prefigured in that period. So you have not just the renewable stuff, you have things on the vegetarianism of the Nazis, which is quite well known. So Goering was saying about how cattle farmers were anti-patriotic because it needed so much more grain to feed a cow than it did a human being. And Himmler basically complained about the food industry and advertising was sort of forcing people to eat things that they actually didn't want to. And there's this sort of back to this really odd thing in Germany. It's quite difficult to understand because German power is based on its industry. I mean, it came to it was blood and iron that united Germany in the 19th century, and it was iron and steel and coal that gave its power in the 20th century. And yet there's this strain in German culture that is strongly against industrialization and wants to repeal the Industrial Revolution. And it's this sort of bipolar aspect of Germany and of German culture that has now been exported to other Greens around the rest of the world. First of all, to Europe, and I think the rise of the Greens in Germany, which started in 1980, it started with anti-nuclear protests. It then morphed into the peace movement in the 1980s. They were hugely opposed to the Reagan arms build-up. They're effectively sock puppets of the Kremlin. And then you see the rise of environmentalism across Europe, and many of the ideas, those ideas you also find picked up in the United States. And going back to California, you think Ronald Reagan was governor, that California was an extremely successful economy, and it also believed in conservation. I mean, in my first book that Kathleen mentioned, I've got a terrific photo of Ronald Reagan going up one of the Sierras to campaign against a road project that the Nixon administration wanted. So there was a history of conservation. And then came Jerry Brown with these very kooky European ideas you remember Fritz Schumacher, Small is Beautiful, also Arne Naess of the Norwegian ecologist. And you have these extreme environmental views that have been sort of circulating in California, where you go back to the 70s.
Incredible. In the lawsuit that the 200 are filing against California Air Resources Board, they talk about housing projects, and to have a net zero housing project would be unauthorized, unworkable, and counterproductive, applying to new housing, this is just new housing, which the Green New Deal calls on every single building and home to be updated and to be more efficient. I had something that I'd written and published recently that talked about the cost of changing LED light bulbs that the city of New York is currently doing in apartments to the tune of almost $2,000 per apartment to update light bulbs. And it's because they have union contract requirements I think it's about $185 per hour that they're paid per person. So you've got to have, how many Aggies does it change to take a light bulb? Double that in New York. And then you got to have a guy that sits outside and watches the car, and then probably someone standing there in a yellow vest, ironically, on the road to make sure no one hits the car. But all jokes aside, the costs are astronomical, and they do get pushed on down to the consumers. And we keep talking about Germany and California and now New York. Germany's electricity rates have increased 50% since they've started their ambitions, their misguided ambitions. But keep in mind that's still 3 times what we pay on average here in the United States.
And the other fact that's interesting about Germany is that their carbon emissions have basically been flat. I mean, yes. Don't forget that. And the reason their carbon emissions fell at all was because of reunification. When, thanks to NATO and the arms build-up and to Ronald Reagan, the communist regimes fell, and East Germany had an incredibly archaic, terribly polluting power sector and industries which essentially got closed down, and that's why their CO2 emissions fell. It was just sort of accidental. It wasn't a plan. But when they've actually tried to cut their emissions, they failed.
So one thing that the Green New Deal calls for, the resolution calls for the elimination of all greenhouse gases. And I can't believe that people have actually signed on to co-sponsor this legislation. Think in mind, 95% of the greenhouse gases are water vapor, which would eliminate all life on Earth. That just boggles my mind. Thoughts on that, or anything that Alexandra occasionally crazy is working on or dreaming up every other day?
Well, I think that just goes to show that global warming is about a tool of social control. It gives them a rationale to control every single aspect of life, of lifestyle, and it's very interesting that there was a precursor again to this, which is in the book, which was the acid rain scare. If you remember, in the 1980s, we were told acid rain was going to destroy the forests, and in fact, the science on that proved to be wrong, and there was a 10-year federal study that demonstrated that. Nonetheless, it went ahead. But what's really interesting was that we still have all the scrubbers and so forth, and the propaganda that we're saving the lakes and the forests. And this is incredibly corrupted science that we're talking about. And science has been weaponized to browbeat. We can't even have a serious discussion. You can't question the science, which hopefully there is an initiative that in the White House that's been reported to review the government's use of climate science. But that is, the penultimate chapter of the book is called Spiral of Silence. And that's one of the things you see is that they try to clamp down on dissenting opinion. They try to ban anyone who questions the science, and they just mob people who just put a question mark on it.
So one of the things we don't see anything about, we hear about greenhouse gases, we hear about carbon, but we don't hear anything about particulate matter. Why isn't there a standard within the World Health Organization or the United Nations for particulate matter? And should there be, because that's clearly an area where the United States is winning, and we are leading the world in clean air. And I had a conversation with a DC Capitol staffer, senior level staffer that works in one of the energy committees for a senator, and I said, I'd love to come and visit with you and talk to you about how the United States is leading the world in cleaning the air. And he says, we are?
Yeah, I'll tell you why the United States is certainly leading Europe. And I don't think it's anything to do with the United States is doing. It's because of what the Europeans have been doing. Two things. Diesel, right? The diesel policy is there to cut it was a part of a decarbonisation effort. The idea that less CO2 is emitted because diesels because of the mileage that you get out. And secondly, and unbelievably, is reintroduction of wood burning, because biomass is good. It's renewable. So you have in city centres, you have people burning logs. I mean, how crazy is that? So the urban air quality in cities across Europe has declined. Paris, London, Florence, Luxembourg, you've seen these declines. So I'm not sure the US is leading the world, anything positive it may be doing. It's leading because the Europeans have been trashing their air quality.
By burning renewables. Incredible. Are there any trees left in Sherwood Forest? Is there a Sherwood Forest left?
Yeah, I mean, that's the other thing. I mean, just the cutting down of trees that you get. Of course, a lot of the trees that are being cut down and put into European power stations coming from the United States.
Yeah, there was another article in the Wall Street Journal, I believe, last week talking about the timber industry in the southeastern United States that's shipping trees via boat that's probably burning bunker fuel across the international waters to transport trees to be burned in Europe, and that just didn't make sense.
And you think of the knock-on effects to people in the United States, which means higher lumber prices, which means building a new house costs more. This is bad news.
So European renewable policies are impact the cost of building homes in the United States.
I think that's right.
Unbelievable. Oh, well, Rupert, this has been wonderful. Thank you so much for your time. I appreciate the conversation. I have learned a lot, and I've gotten more frustrated learning about more policies and how global policies do impact all of us in the globe. And so it's been very interesting to me. Thank you very much for your time. At this time, we'll open up for question and answers from the audience. Clint has a microphone back here, and we'll walk around. Let's please use the mic so everybody can hear. Any questions from the audience?
Thank you. Bob Green. One of the interesting statements that has been used lately that I've been using for a long time is you've heard from AOC all about the Benjamins. Well, that's the way I feel about, climate change and all of these policies. It's never been about saving the planet. It's all about the Benjamins and how they will be redistributed and to whom. Would you like to comment on that?
That's absolutely right. I think, but there's a really odd thing about the left going on redistribution, because the redistribution, there are two aspects to the redistribution. One is on the global level, and the deal with emerging countries. And of course, AOC, when they say we must decarbonize, they forget they're actually climate isolationists, that they completely forget what's happening in the developing world. And the developing world is going to carbonize whilst the Western world tries to decarbonize. And it's going to make no difference at all. So there's, as part of the deal for China and India and so forth, signing up to Paris, they were promised $100 billion a year in climate aid, which actually isn't materializing. So that's one aspect of redistribution. The other aspect is from poor people in the West to green investors, to green vested interests. And to give you an example, electricity prices from the average price per megawatt hour for gas and coal-fired electricity is around about £50, call it $60 per megawatt hour. Stuff from renewables, from wind and solar, they get paid about $150 per megawatt hour. In fact, their profit is almost the same as the price that a gas and coal-fired power station gets. So it is redistribution. It's from the poor to the rich.
Essentially, when you talk about subsidies or tax breaks, people always talk about the oil and gas industry getting trillions of dollars in tax subsidies and tax breaks. When you break it down to an energy equivalent here in the United States, at least in Texas, the wind and solar are 20 to 30 times. So per energy equivalent. And again, that's why we're seeing a decreased investment in new power generation from traditional sources. Any other questions? Right. Oh.
Hello there. Bill Oswald, thank you very much for coming again to Austin in the middle of all of our scooter revolution. Please don't get hit. In your Wall Street Journal article yesterday, you mentioned capacity markets as a potential option, which is paying generators whether they provide power or not. Texas fought that battle a few years ago. Being the only energy-only market left in Texas, we were afraid that our power prices would go up similar to other regions of the United States like the Pennsylvania, New Jersey area. Would you care to expand on your comments on capacity markets?
Yeah, I mean, the capacity market I know well is the one in the UK, because the government woke up and thought, wow, we're not going to have any thermal power station capacity left, and the lights are going to go out. So they created a capacity market. And so they ran capacity market auctions. And the hope was to get lots of new gas-fired power stations. Virtually none of that materialized. Instead, they got lots of diesel generation. So we've gone from having efficient coal-fired power stations, gas-fired power stations, which are being taken off the grid, to highly polluting, expensive, they're designed for peak, but now they're going to do more diesel capacity. And that, when you make these interventions in markets, there's a thing Ludwig von Mises says about the spiral of interventions. Eventually, you're sucked into making more and more interventions, and eventually you have no market left, and you basically have to let the government run the whole thing. And that's where the renewable push will end, when basically the government has to run the whole of the energy market.
Bruce Albert, Rupert, thank you for coming back. I read your book, the first one, cover to cover, very carefully. And being an engineer myself, I can appreciate the depth that you went into, the history, but also all the research and taking apart the models that have been used to gin up the need to do something. And you do a great job talking about those models and how the UN and others didn't get the answer they wanted, so they went ahead anyway. I want to ask you about the big one there, which is referring to it as climate change instead of global warming. What is the link to climate change? How do the scientists draw a link between the two?
Yeah, I think in the second book you'll find something quite interesting, in that the war on coal actually started in Sweden in the late 60s, early 70s, because the Swedish Social Democrats had a very big nuclear power program, and they wanted to tell Swedes, Swedish voters, well, if you don't have nukes, you're going to have coal-fired. You'll have lots of coal. And so they started off, the first thing they did was acid rain. The acid rain scare came from Sweden. And the government scientist who wrote that report was Bert Berlin, who, as you will know from the first book, became the first chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And actually, I read his report on acid rain. It's very much like an IPCC, highly politicized. And then, after acid rain, the Swedish government then started saying, well, there's an interview in 1974 with the Swedish Prime Minister in which he says, global warming will be the big issue at the end of the 20th century. Now, that was 1974. That's when Al Gore was still at law school. So this thing has long antecedents, and it was politicized. The key thing is it was politicized right from the word go.
Patty Barrett from Houston. I don't know if you're familiar with Hans Rosling and his work, but he has a website called Gapminder and has been very much, his work on demonstrating in very comprehensible ways global trends through countries across time and on different factors, we have found really compelling. But one of the things that you've spoken about so reminded me of his work when he talks about people in third world countries whose mode of transportation goes from bare feet to feet in flip-flops to bicycles, and that we who are traveling, the common man can travel by airplane, are looking at people who are feeling really blessed if they can move from flip-flops to a bicycle and saying, no, you can't have the kind of energy that we had. And I just wanted to know if you were familiar with his work and if you had any comments on that.
Yeah, I think what Hans Rosling did was incredibly important in showing how capitalism, essentially how the capitalist process improves people's lives. And Kathleen mentioned my work on the World Bank, and I wrote a report on the World Bank, and it was really quite striking that when you look at coal consumption per capita, when you're looking at a country like Bangladesh, it's literally in ounces per capita per year. These are countries that are incredibly energy poor, and they need more energy. And denying them the energy that we take for granted it's not just economic, it's immoral. It's immoral.
It absolutely is immoral, and you talk about some of these developing countries. I had an opportunity in 2016 to visit Myanmar. I was in the Philippines, was in Singapore, and then was in Myanmar. And Myanmar for 4 days, and was at a meeting at the Department of Energy. And we were there on this economic development trade mission from the state of Texas, talking about opportunities to import our energy-rich resources, natural gas, into Myanmar to provide them clean and reliable electricity. And we're in the Department of Energy building, and they're talking about wind and solar while the power goes out 3 times. 3 times, because the demand increased significantly. And you talk about this progression of feet to flip-flops to bicycles to cars to airplanes. Well, and I'm a big fan of the Tour de France, and the office will know this because I play it on my iPad as I'm sitting there working and just hearing it in the background. The Tour de France winners are going to come out of California in 20 years because CARB is going to, and this is part of the lawsuit right here, that their answer to reducing vehicle miles traveled is by increasing bicycling. So people who live in San Joaquin are not going to have to bicycle to get to work in San Francisco. So in 20 years, I'm predicting that Californians will be on the podium at the Tour de France. That's my prediction. The gentleman here had a question.
Bell. I came in from Houston this morning. Glad to see you. Great admirer of the Texas Public Policy Foundation in general, and Kathleen most particularly in terms of all you do. I write a lot of books. I guess I've written a few hundred for Forbes and Newsmax and so on, and some books. Scared Witless, Prophets and Prophets of Climate Doom and so on. I didn't come here to hawk books, but I just want to say that there are a lot of things to be disturbed about, and one of the things that's come to mind recently is the misinformation about how much energy we get from wind and solar. And if you call Google and say, Google, your Siri, whoever, how much energy do we get from wind and solar? You say, well, 2017 we got like 12% of our electricity from renewables. I said, no, I didn't ask you that. I asked you how much energy we get from wind and solar. And then you peel back and says, well, and, you know, renewables is 4 sectors. There's electricity, there's industrial, there's transportation, there's residential, commercial. And you peel it back and say, well, we get 38% of our energy, BTUs, 38% in the electrical sector from wind and solar, or from renewables. Say, well, I didn't ask you that. What's renewables? Well, renewables are 17%, but only 27% of the 17% of the 38% came from wind and solar. And all the other sectors, almost nothing, you know. Transportation is almost entirely petroleum. You look at industrial, it's coal and natural gas and so on. So there's gross misrepresentation. And I'm talking, you know, the Energy Information Administration, and I don't think they're corrupt, but why is it, you know, this tremendous misinformation? No, we get 3.2% of our energy, and it's not reliable energy, and I think that's inflated. That's what you pay for, not what you get. And then you have the backup reserve of course, of the spinning reserve to keep the grid balanced. And they don't tell you that the life cycle on a wind turbine is 14 years. So we're going to build all these. We're going to build out this forest of 400-foot tall towers and oceans of solar panels, and they're going to be replaced every 14 years. Is the information as corrupt in the UK as it is here?
Yeah, I had a little post in the Washington Examiner last week on this very question about the claims of corporations of 100% renewable electricity, and as the guy that President Trump called Tim Apple the other day, at Apple's claim of 100% renewable, which Alex Epstein's did a tremendous article on this, pulling apart that claim. And I actually used his words because to avoid any, you know, his words there about the accounting misrepresentation. And what you have you have the federal government validating this stuff with the renewable energy credits. And I say in the article, these aren't RECs, they're FECs, fake energy certificates.
I'm Reagan Bohack from Houston. What do you think of Generation 4 nuclear reactors, and would that help reduce emissions?
I think first of all, I'm very pro nuclear power, but I think it should stand on its own feet. And I don't have a view as to whether nukes or the latest generation of nuclear power is economic or not. I think part of the problem with nuclear power is the regulation and the tighter regulation of it, which has been forcing up. It's the one sort of source of energy where the costs each generation, the costs seem to go up. And I haven't, to be honest, I haven't got to the bottom. I haven't studied it enough. But it does seem nuclear clearly. It is if you are concerned about climate change, you should be busting everything to make nuclear economic, because that is the only source other than hydropower which meets the criteria that the Greens allegedly believe in, which of course, and they're against it.
Yes, Rupert. This is Doug and Flanagan from CFACT. I have a question: is how will the appointment of David Malpass to the World Bank change the World Bank and its policies on environment?
I think it's a terrific appointment. I was enormously heartened by it, because thinking ahead of, first of all, it was terrific to see that his predecessor, who was an out-and-out Green, who was carrying on President Obama's war on coal and exporting it around the world, and that he got heaved out. And I don't really believe the cover story that this is a guy who is one of the top financial positions in the world. You pick up the phone, you can talk to any world leader you want, and the guy says, well, actually, I want to go and work as a sort of senior vice president for an infrastructure fund somewhere in New York. Not sure I completely believe that cover story, but it's terrific that he's gone. He was a thoroughly bad thing. And not only was it the war on coal, when he turned up to Paris to celebrate the second anniversary of the Paris Climate Agreement, he came out and said, well, the World Bank's also going to ban financing of upstream oil and gas in poor countries, which just to deny countries access to their mineral wealth just seems just absolutely appalling. Anyhow, he's been heaved out. I think Malpass is far and away the best replacement one could have thought. He will be hamstrung, unfortunately, by the policies that have been agreed. But first of all, he won't make things worse. And secondly, I think he will begin to pull things around, but he will have to. He will doubtless have to walk very carefully, tread very carefully, because you remember what happened to Paul Wolfowitz when he was president of the World Bank. And if you get a staff rebellion and they kind of, so he's got to be careful what he does. So don't set your expectations too high, but it's a terrific development.
Hi, my name is Susan Meredith, and I appreciate what you're saying about nuclear, that, you know, it's definitely better than the CO2 emissions, and also that the Green New Deal is, you know, too extreme. What I wonder, though, is, you know, we seem to have this polarized view of, you know, that all renewables are bad or all renewables are good, or all fossil fuels are bad and all fossil fuels are good. And the truth is, what you're talking about with the demand for energy going up and up and up, it's not either or. It's how do we work together to have the renewables be doing what they need to do. And by the way, storage is the key. I mean, if we have storage, anybody wants a business opportunity, figure out utility scale storage. That's the holy grail. So how do we do that? How do we grow renewables as much as possible? And how do we make fossil fuels cleaner? And how can we work together instead of this polarized way of talking?
The key thing with renewables is the intermittency, and that the cost of their intermittency at the moment is transferred to the rest of the grid and to thermal generators. So the answer to the question, how can the two work together, is that the cost of intermittency should be borne on the capacity that imposes that, on a cost causation principle. And if on that basis, wind and solar can stand up, good luck. But what you don't want to have is hidden subsidies. Effectively, intermittency, they're given, there's a hidden subsidy which renewables get from the rest of the system. And furthermore, if you start making renewable investors pay for intermittency, they have a massive incentive to innovate for storage. Because if you say to them, you have to make contractually firm commitments to deliver so much power at a certain time of day, they therefore have an incentive to say, we're going to bring technologies on stream so we can store our wind and solar and make it available when we're contracted to provide it. So I think that is the way forward to making the system whole, if you like.
All right. No, I agree. We should be working together, and it's in all of the above, and that's what Life Powered is about. We're about all of the above. Not fans of subsidies because we believe that hurts one area over another. And one of the areas of innovation that I love is with the liquefied natural gas. We've seen this density and this technology really grow over the last 20 years, and now we're exporting that freedom around the world in the form of liquefied natural gas and light sweet crude to other countries so that they can have access. We talked a lot about Germany, who's building this huge pipeline from Russia right now. And wouldn't it be great, people like Poland, and they're buying Texas natural gas to the benefit of our economic stabilization fund, to the benefit of our roads, and to the benefit of our public education system. And I think that's a great thing. So we are making progresses when it comes to density. There are utilities that have tankers of liquefied natural gas sitting idly by in really cold winters to inject that into the pipelines so that we continue to have heat in our homes and so that we can cook and live by rather than having to burn wood or cow dung in our homes. And that's why we have not nearly as many issues with indoor particulate matter here in this country that third world developing countries do. And if it weren't for the access to the fuels that we have and the energy that we have, we certainly wouldn't see landfill gas. which we're starting to see people as they build landfills that are putting pipes that are aerated that you suck the methane out of decomposing trash, clean it, dry it, put it in a pipeline. And I think that's the kind of innovation that we need and will continue to see as people around the world get access to our freedoms here that we have here in the United States. I think that is all the time that we have. There are going to be books that are available for purchase, and Rupert's going to go over there, and we're going to go into the lobby, I believe, and sign some books. Thank you so much, Rupert Darwall. Appreciate your time here in Texas.